Okay, I want to discuss what must be one of the most pressing human rights issues in the world today, and yet also one that is arguably among the least covered. In a world full of persecution and human rights abuses, obviously it's difficult to cover everything, but I do think there are certain reasons why this isn't getting the coverage it should. Anyway, I'm going to read out this report. It's from the Daily Mail, and I'll put a link to the article. But for anyone who wants to say, oh, well, this is the biased source, I can use plenty of other sources that say similar things. So that's that. So I'm going to read this out. Bear with me, it's a little long, but I think it's important to read it all out. And then I'm going to comment a bit afterwards about what I think of this and some of the wider issues. So, a little bit of background. Obviously, last week was the celebration of the Lunar New Year. This is now the year of the pig, which, in the context of this report, is kind of, uh, you could say, adding insult to injury. But it's the year of the pig. Millions of people in China, in Vietnam, and in the diasporas around the world are celebrating. And nothing wrong with that. But as people are celebrating, there is growing persecution going on in Xinjiang, and it's on a massive scale. Anyway, I'm going to read out this report and then discuss some of those issues further. Muslims in China are forced to eat pork and drink alcohol at Lunar New Year's dinners and are threatened with imprisonment in re education camps if they refuse to take part. That's the headline, and this is the report. Muslims in China's far west region of Xinjiang are being forced to eat pork and drink alcohol at events during the country's Lunar New Year holiday, residents have claimed. Residents in the Ili Kazakh Autonomous Prefecture said they were invited to Chinese New Year dinners where pork and alcohol were served. Chinese officials threatened to send them to re education camps if they refused to participate, according to a report by Radio Free Asia. Photos sent to Radio Free Asia also showed a Chinese official in Yanning City visiting Muslim households and distributing raw pork on Monday, eve of the Year of the Pig. People were also forced to display Chinese New Year decorations, such as red lanterns and couplets, outside their homes. Just scrolling down, this is a series of photographs here. One of them showing Xi Jinping in a big television screen in a public street. And the caption reads, residents walk through a security checkpoint into the Hotan Bazaar, where a screen shows Chinese President Xi Jinping in Hotan in the western Xinjiang province. And I continue, both pork and alcohol are forbidden in Islam, and Chinese New Year is not usually celebrated by Muslims. Kazakh people in Xinjiang have never eaten pork, one unnamed resident told RFA. Starting last year, some people have been forced to eat pork so that they can celebrate a festival belonging to the Han Chinese. Kazakhs don't celebrate Spring Festival, a Kazakh woman named Hisse told RFA. Our main festivals are Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha. Spring Festival is for Han Chinese and people who believe in Buddhism. If we won't put up the couplets or hang up lanterns, they say we are two-faced and they send us to re-education camps, she said, adding that officials have begun delivering pork to around 80% of Kazakh households in Savan County since the end of 2018. Just scrolling down, there's quite a lot of photographs accompanying this piece. Dilshat Raksit, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, spokesman for the exile group World Uyghur Congress, and I should say the Chinese regime considers that a terrorist organization. I'm not going to comment further there, but Dilshat Raksit, spokesman for the exile group World Uyghur Congress, said they have received similar reports. According to our information, the Chinese government is stepping up its campaign to assimilate Uyghurs into Han Chinese culture, he said. They are forcing Uyghurs to celebrate Lunar New Year to put up decorative couplets. They are also forcing Uyghurs to drink alcohol to show that they don't subscribe to extreme religious beliefs and don't disrespect traditional Chinese culture. Um, Drinking is a big part of Chinese culture, particularly in southwest and southeast China. Up to 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities are believed to be held in extra legal detention in Xinjiang. I'll read that again. Up to 1 million, 1 million people are held in extra legal detention in Xinjiang, according to previous UN estimates, prompting an international outcry. Not enough of an international outcry. The region is home to more than 10 million ethnic Uyghurs. So that's 1 in 10 people in this region. 1 in 10. Detainees who most vigorously criticize the people and things they love are rewarded, and those who refuse to do so are punished with solitary confinement, beatings, and food deprivation. More photos here showing the indoctrination classes. Former detainees have previously claimed they were forced to eat pork and drink alcohol as punishment inside the camps. While Beijing initially denied the existence of re education camps, the chairman of Xinjiang's government, Shorat Sakir, told the official Xinhua news agency in October that the facilities are an effective tool to protect the country from terrorism and provide vocational training for Uyghurs. A previous report published by a Christian NGO, China Aid, claimed that Muslims in Xinjiang had been forced to take part in New Year celebrations in February last year. Last October, officials in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, launched a campaign against halal products. Radical Muslim Uyghurs have killed hundreds in recent years, and China considers the region a threat to peace in a country where the majority is Han Chinese. Just scrolling down. That's the end of the report. Okay, let me just say something while it's on my mind before I overlook this. Imagine we're talking here about forced integration, forcing one of China's minorities to assimilate in a very brutal way. Now, imagine if in the West, in Chinatowns, the Lunar New Year was banned because it wasn't in keeping with Western culture. Imagine the outcry, imagine the cries of racism we would hear from the Chinese embassies. Now, just for the record, I don't believe that should be the approach. But my point here is double standards and the routine arrogance and hypocrisy of the Chinese regime. Um, so here's the thing. China has a very troubled history with its Muslim minorities, and it's little known today, but in the 19th century there were some extremely bloody conflicts. The Dongan Revolt, for example, against the Qing dynasty, may have led up to 8 million deaths. 8 million deaths. That are the estimates. If you look at the Wikipedia article, that's what it suggests um, in terms of the demographic losses. Um, and there's other examples. Now, this is blatantly an extreme abuse of human rights, forcing people to eat a product that is against their core beliefs. Um, but it isn't just that, it's the forced indoctrination, it's the attempts to brainwash these people into loving the party. There has been tensions in the region. Back in 2009, there were ethnic clashes, and there were victims on both sides. There was Uyghurs killed, there was Han people killed. Um, China so far hasn't had the sort of militant Islamism that has been seen in other parts of the world. There has been some attacks. A few years ago, 2014, there was a bloody knife attack in Kunming railway station, and a lot of innocent people were killed. 35 innocent bystanders. There was also a ramming incident in Tiananmen Square a few years ago, and I believe 5 people were killed in that incident. But given the size of China, proportionally speaking, it hasn't had the sort of Islamist onslaught that we've seen in Europe. Um, Now, the problem here is I mentioned that I think there's a few reasons why this isn't getting enough coverage. Number one is actually in the West, there will be limited sympathy because people will be thinking about Islamist extremists. They'll be thinking of ISIS and Boko Haram, and they'll say, "Oh well, the Chinese are standing up to the Islamists." But the problem here is that what we're talking about is collective punishment of all Uyghur people. And no reasonable, rational person can say that is okay. In the long run, this is going to be counterproductive. This is going to breed Islamism. And what's notable is so far the Islamic world has been strangely quiet about this. They're very busy attacking Israel, and yet they're strangely quiet about this. Look at Pakistan. It hasn't said anything. Now, I believe that is all down to trade. Pakistan and China have very close ties at the moment. They've got arms deals, they've got trade deals. So much for the Islamic Ummah, standing by Muslim brothers and sisters. It's kind of ironic. Um, but make no mistake about it, what is happening in Xinjiang is an abomination. It's disgusting, and it's just the latest example of the cruelty of the Chinese government, the arrogance of the Chinese government. This is a regime that will do absolutely anything to stay in power. Doesn't matter how cruel, how sick, or how callous that is. They will do anything to stay in power. And of course, they'll use the usual line when human rights groups and Western media try to talk about this. They'll say, "Oh, it's our internal affairs." Well, firstly, there's a legitimate argument to be made about whether or not Xinjiang is legitimately part of China, just like the Tibet issue. I believe that the priority when it comes to criticizing China should be on human rights across the board. I don't think it should be on, for example, freedom of Tibet or freedom of Xinjiang. Nevertheless, that's important in this issue because they're saying the Uyghurs are two-faced. Um, the fact of the matter is, for centuries, there has been examples of Han bullying and forced assimilation in a very brutal way. That was the case in Tibet, and now it's the case in Xinjiang. And I think the world needs to start speaking out on this. China is a powerful country, but I think that the Chinese regime believe they get away with it because I think, frankly, too many governments are hesitant in criticizing the Chinese regime. The point I would make is I despise Islamism. I would have no problem with what the Chinese government was doing if they were targeting Islamist groups, Taliban esque, ISIS esque groups who were, wanting to enslave women and so on. But that's not what is happening here. They're collectively punishing all Muslims. Now, there will be some people in the West who are fine with that because they also have it in for all Muslims. You will find few people as critical as I am on pan Islamism. I am a staunch opponent of blasphemy laws. I'm a staunch opponent of Sharia law. And I think there are many areas to criticize the religion of Islam. But what China is doing is going to backfire. It's going to polarize people. It's going to brutalize people. And I think ultimately it will radicalize people. So China is sowing the seeds for future jihad. And, watch this space. If there is a security situation in China in the future, and that remains to be seen because China has some of the most stringent security apparatus in the world. But if that does happen, then it won't, terrorism is terrorism. I would never ever condone terrorism, but the Chinese government will be at least partly to blame for that, for the brutality in Xinjiang. And the way China is right now, nationalism is kind of a national religion. You know, they say they're against extreme religious ideas, but in China, ultranationalism is the religion, whereby it's in the education system, and I've seen this firsthand from a very early age. Chinese nationals are told to love the party and never to question the party. And whenever any outsider says anything, then they're either a Western spy or they're interfering in our internal affairs. This is what the Chinese regime uses to condone its brutality. I mean, you saw in the report there, they contradicted themselves, first of all, denying that re education camps existed, and then claiming they're for vocational training. What sort of vocational training do you have people being forced to drink alcohol and consume pork and receiving beatings? And that's only what we've heard about. That's only what is being leaked out. God knows what is going on behind closed doors. It's sinister. So, shame on the Chinese government. Shame on them for committing this mass brutality, this totally unjustified collective punishment of all Uyghur people. They like to make propaganda images, especially coming in the Mao era, showing the minorities, praising the Communist Party. And what they'll do is they'll get hand-picked people from those minorities, who are basically puppets of the party. And then they'll say, "Oh, this proves that we treat our minorities fairly." But what's happening in Xinjiang is repugnant. And I here's the thing: I don't think the onus should be on the West to be on the forefront of speaking out against this. I would like to see more action from Islamic states. I mean, they're being profoundly hypocritical when they attack Israel, and yet they're staying silent against China. Could it be that it's a lot easier to criticize little Israel than it is to criticize a major power like China? But if the Islamic world collectively condemn China for this, I think we might see a bit of change. But I think the reason this is continuing is because at the moment, the only people speaking out are brave human rights activists um, and newspapers. The Chinese regime will do everything they can to try to silence this subject. They will do everything they can. They will threaten people. Because they're bullies, and this is how bullies behave. The Chinese regime is run by thugs, autocrats, and bullies, and Emperor Xi is at the very top. I mean, Xi isn't bombastic in the way that Trump or Duterte or Erdogan is, but make no mistake about it, he is a callous dictator, and we see signs of that all the time. This is utterly shameful, and it is one of the worst examples of human rights abuses in the world today. And you don't have to be religious to see that. You don't have to be left wing, and you don't have to be. It's not a case of being pro Islam. It's a case of understanding that collective punishment is wrong. It's a case of understanding that this will backfire. So shame on the Chinese regime, shame on their cowardly censorship, and to any Chinese nationals who want to come to this video to insult me or say what you will, or what they might do is get into whataboutery. What about the West this? What about the West that? Big difference. In the West, we can freely debate, for example, foreign policy. In China, there's only one opinion allowed, and that is pro communist. Shame on the Chinese regime. Shame on them.